It was supposed to be the beginning of a fairy tale. In the heart of Toronto, under glittering chandeliers and before hundreds of guests, a wealthy Canadian businessman stood proudly beside his young bride. He was in his early 50s, powerful and established, the heir to a family fortune. She was barely 26, radiant, breathtaking, the very picture of youth and promise. Together they seemed unstoppable, a union of wealth and beauty, security and ambition. The wedding was the talk of the city. Guests whispered about the groom's expensive tailored suit, the bride's diamond necklace, the imported flowers flown in from Paris. To the outside world, it was a love story written in gold. Friends and relatives toasted to forever happiness, and cameras captured smiles that would soon haunt the headlines. But just weeks later, the photographs of that glittering night would appear again, not in glossy magazines, but on the front pages of newspapers across the world. The captions were no longer about love or luxury. They screamed of violence, betrayal, and death. Because this fairy tale did not last, it ended abruptly, brutally, in the locked suite of a five-star honeymoon resort. The bride, once draped in white silk and pearls, was found lifeless. Her groom, bloodied, trembling, and in shock, was arrested as the prime suspect. What went wrong? How could a marriage that began in such splendor collapse into murder within days? The answer, investigators would soon discover, lay in the bride's carefully guarded past. A past she thought she had buried forever. A past that, once revealed, shattered her new husband's pride and ignited a rage that no one could control. This is the story of a wealthy Canadian groom, a young wife with a dangerous secret, and a honeymoon that turned into a nightmare. It is a story of lies, betrayal, and the deadly consequences of love built on deception. And it begins not with blood, but with a promise, spoken beneath the shimmering lights of a wedding hall, that till death do them part. To understand the murder that shocked two nations, you first have to understand the man at the center of it all, the groom. Born into privilege, Daniel Whitmore had never known the struggles of ordinary life. His family's wealth stretched back generations, tied to real estate holdings, private investments, and international business ventures. In Toronto's elite circles, the Whitmore name carried weight. It meant influence, access, and power. Daniel grew up with the unspoken belief that the world was his to shape, his to command. By his early 50s, Daniel was the image of success. Tall, broad-shouldered, always dressed in tailored suits, he carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man used to being respected. His friends described him as intelligent, calculating, and deeply ambitious. But beneath the polished exterior, others saw something else, an obsessive need for control and a fragile ego that could not withstand betrayal. Daniel's early adult life had been marked by indulgence. Expensive cars, exclusive clubs, and glamorous companions filled his 20s and 30s. Yet when it came to marriage, Daniel had been less fortunate. His first union, an arrangement within the Canadian elite, collapsed within a few years. Friends hinted at infidelity, jealousy, and Daniel's volatile temper. After the divorce, he retreated further into his work, pouring his energy into expanding his fortune and reputation. But wealth, as Daniel discovered, can be lonely. By his late 40s, he was tired of fleeting relationships. He longed for permanence, someone who could stand by him, someone who could project the image of stability he craved. More than love, Daniel wanted loyalty. More than passion, he wanted possession. That's when he began searching for a bride, not among his peers, but beyond them. He wanted youth, beauty, and devotion. He wanted someone who would admire him, depend on him, and never threaten his pride. When Daniel met Alisha, 26, stunning and eager for a fresh start, he was captivated. She was everything he believed he deserved, a woman half his age, from a modest background who seemed dazzled by his world of luxury. To Daniel, she represented both a prize and a promise. She made him feel young again, powerful, desired. But Daniel's desires carried heavy expectations. He expected honesty, submission, and above all, loyalty. His past relationships had left him wary of deceit, and he made it clear to Alisha early on, betrayal was unforgivable. To outsiders, their courtship seemed whirlwind, almost too fast. But for Daniel, there was no time to waste. He had the wealth, he had the power, and now he wanted the one thing he could not buy, devotion. When Alisha agreed to marry him, he felt vindicated. At last, he would have the perfect wife, the perfect marriage, the perfect image. What Daniel could not know, or perhaps refused to see, was that perfection is fragile. Behind Alisha's radiant smile was a secret, one she carried silently into the marriage. To Daniel, she was a treasure, a symbol of loyalty and purity. But the truth was far more complicated, and when it surfaced, it would shatter every illusion he had built around her. Friends would later describe Daniel as both charming and intimidating. He could light up a room with his confidence, but he could just as easily silence it with his temper. Those close to him knew his pride was his weakness. For a man like Daniel, humiliation was more dangerous than poverty. And when humiliation came from the one person he believed he could trust, it was not just his pride that broke, it was his restraint. Daniel Whitmore was not a man accustomed to losing. But on his honeymoon, he would lose everything: his wife, his freedom, and the very legacy he had spent his life protecting. And it all began with a secret he could not forgive. Alisha Verma grew up thousands of miles away from the glittering world she would one day marry into. Born in a modest neighborhood of New Delhi, India, her childhood was marked by struggle and ambition. Her father worked as a government clerk, her mother as a schoolteacher. They dreamed of giving their daughter opportunities they never had. Alisha was bright, determined, and strikingly beautiful. From a young age, she knew her looks set her apart. In her late teens, she began modeling part-time, earning extra income for her family. Friends described her as charismatic, someone who could command attention without trying. But behind the charm was a young woman who carried a hunger for more, a desire to escape the limitations of her background. By her early 20s, Alisha had left India for Canada, enrolling in a student visa program. Toronto felt like a different planet: skyscrapers, luxury cars, and a lifestyle she had only glimpsed in magazines. But life abroad was not easy. She struggled with tuition fees, housing costs, and the constant pressure to succeed. She took small jobs, made connections, and began dating older men who could support her. This period of her life held the secret that would one day unravel everything. In Toronto, before meeting Daniel Whitmore, Alisha had been in a serious relationship with another man, one far from the polished image she later presented. Some accounts suggest he was an older lover who promised her financial stability. Others claim he was married, and their affair ended in scandal. Still others whisper that Alisha herself had once married briefly for immigration purposes, only to dissolve it quietly when things went wrong. What is certain is that Alisha carried shame and fear from her past. Whether it was a failed marriage, a fraudulent visa arrangement, or a relationship that ended badly, she believed that revealing the truth would destroy her future prospects. She learned to bury it, to present herself as untarnished, ready to step into the role of a perfect wife. When she met Daniel, she saw a way out of her struggles. His wealth dazzled her, but more than that, his promise of security gave her a sense of safety she had long craved. He could give her the lifestyle she had dreamed of since childhood. He could erase her past. But the cost of that dream was silence. She never told Daniel about the man or men who had come before him. She never confessed the mistakes, the desperation, the choices that had shaped her life in Canada. She crafted a new identity for him: loyal, innocent, untouched by scandal. Alisha was not without feelings for Daniel. Friends recalled how she spoke of him as protective, generous, and powerful, but beneath her affection lay calculation. To her, Daniel was more than a husband. He was an escape hatch from uncertainty. She believed she could play the role he wanted, a devoted, grateful bride, and that the ghosts of her past would never catch up to her. Yet even in the weeks leading up to the wedding, cracks began to show. Some acquaintances hinted that Alisha seemed nervous, preoccupied. A friend recalled her saying, "If Daniel ever finds out, it will all be over." Still, the marriage went ahead. The diamonds sparkled, the vows were exchanged, and the photographs captured smiles wide enough to hide the fear. Alisha entered that marriage with hope, but also with deception. And deception, as investigators would later reveal, was the one thing Daniel Whitmore could not forgive. Her secret was buried, but not gone. And in the luxurious suite of a honeymoon resort thousands of miles from Toronto, it would surface with devastating force. For Alisha, the wedding was the beginning of a dream. For Daniel, it was the beginning of a nightmare. The wedding of Daniel Whitmore and Alisha Verma was nothing short of spectacular. Held in one of Toronto's most exclusive venues, the ballroom sparkled with chandeliers, crystal tableware, and an ocean of imported roses. Guests described it as something out of a royal fairy tale. Daniel spared no expense. Wine flown in from France, jewelry gifted to Alisha worth hundreds of thousands, and a guest list stacked with business partners, socialites, and family members eager to witness the union. The groom looked every bit the powerful man he was, confident, commanding, basking in the admiration of his peers. The bride was radiant in a custom gown, her smile wide enough to convince even her closest friends that she was stepping into a new life without fear. To the cameras, it was perfection. To the onlookers, it was love. But behind the staged elegance, some noticed subtler signs. Alisha's hands trembling as she signed the marriage certificate. The way Daniel's watchful eyes followed her every move as if guarding his prize. To outsiders, these were nothing more than the jitters of a wedding day. To hindsight, they were foreshadowing. After the vows, the couple boarded a private jet bound for their honeymoon destination. The Maldives, a paradise of turquoise waters, private villas, and pristine beaches. For Daniel, it was a chance to show Alisha the lifestyle she now belonged to. For Alisha, it was an escape into luxury, a world far removed from the struggles of her past. The first days seemed picture-perfect. Photographs show them dining by candlelight on the sand, laughing during a yacht excursion, posing in front of the setting sun. Hotel staff remembered them as glamorous but reserved, Daniel tipping generously, Alisha appearing polite yet distant. To those watching, they were the image of newlywed bliss, but appearances can be deceiving. Alisha's phone rarely left her side. She seemed tense whenever she received messages, though she quickly dismissed them when Daniel asked. A hotel attendant recalled once hearing raised voices from their villa, though the couple later appeared calm at dinner. Still, for the outside world, nothing seemed amiss. They were a wealthy couple enjoying a dream vacation, living the fantasy millions envied. No one could have predicted that the same honeymoon suite filled with flowers and champagne would soon be a crime scene. For Daniel, the honeymoon was supposed to be the sealing of a perfect union, proof to himself and the world that he had found his flawless bride. But within days, his illusions would crumble. A secret message, a phone call, or a piece of evidence from Alisha's past was about to surface. The paradise was about to turn into a prison. The Maldives would not remember their laughter. It would remember the screams. For Daniel Whitmore, the honeymoon was meant to be more than a vacation. It was his victory lap, proof to himself and to everyone back home that he had finally won. He had the wealth, the influence, and now the perfect young bride. For a man whose pride meant everything, this was supposed to be the crowning chapter of his life. But on the fourth night of their stay in the Maldives, Daniel's world began to unravel. The moment began innocently enough. The couple had returned from dinner by the beach, a meal lit by tiki torches and accompanied by champagne. Alisha had excused herself to the bathroom, leaving her phone on the dresser. Daniel, restless and half-drunk, noticed it buzz with a new notification. For most husbands, it would have been nothing. For Daniel, it was temptation. He picked up the phone. What he saw shattered the fragile fantasy he had built. The message was short, almost cryptic, but damning enough. "You can't just erase the past, Alisha. One day he will know." Daniel froze, his heart pounded as his mind raced. Who was the sender? What past? What was she hiding from him? When Alisha returned, Daniel confronted her immediately. At first, she denied everything, claiming it was a mistake, a wrong number. But Daniel's suspicion had already taken root. He demanded the truth, his voice rising, his fists clenching. Under pressure, fragments of the secret began to spill out. Alisha admitted that before meeting him, she had been in a long-term relationship in Canada, one that ended badly. But it was more complicated than that. According to some reports, she had been married briefly, possibly in a sham arrangement for immigration. Others claimed she had been romantically involved with a married man, a wealthy figure who later tried to blackmail her. The details varied depending on who told the story, but to Daniel, the facts no longer mattered. What mattered was that his bride, the woman he had presented to the world as flawless and pure, had lied. The confrontation escalated. Witnesses in nearby villas later reported hearing raised voices echoing through the night air. Daniel's booming rage, Alisha's pleas, the sharp sound of objects thrown against the walls. Daniel felt humiliated, betrayed. He had spent his life building an empire, controlling every detail of his public image, ensuring no one could question his power. And now, on the one occasion where he had dared to believe in love, he discovered that he had been deceived. For a man like Daniel, deception was worse than death. Alisha, in tears, begged him to understand. She told him the past had nothing to do with their marriage, that she had hidden it only to protect their relationship. She promised she was loyal, that she wanted to start fresh. But Daniel could not hear her. To him, every word was another insult, another reminder of the humiliation he now carried. He saw her not as a wife, but as a fraud who had tainted his pride. Later investigations revealed that Daniel made several frantic calls that night, one to a close friend in Toronto, another to his lawyer. In both conversations, his words were slurred with alcohol and rage. He spoke of betrayal, of being made a fool, of not being able to face the world knowing the truth. What happened next was a slow descent into fury. The couple spent the following day in silence, barely leaving their villa. Staff recalled Alisha sitting alone by the pool, her eyes red from crying. Daniel, meanwhile, paced inside, chain-smoking, drinking heavily, staring at his phone as though it held the answers. By the evening, the tension had reached a breaking point. Another message arrived on Alisha's phone, this one more direct. "If he finds out everything, he'll leave you. You can't hide forever." Daniel saw it, and that was enough. The confrontation that followed would last hours. Shouts turned to screams, and screams turned into violence. The paradise of their honeymoon became the stage for the ultimate betrayal, and the beginning of a deadly spiral from which there would be no return. Daniel Whitmore's perfect marriage was over, but the worst was yet to come. The evening of August 14th began like any other night at the resort. The sound of waves lapping against the shore, palm trees swaying in the breeze, and couples enjoying cocktails beneath the stars. But inside Villa 12, paradise had already turned poisonous. By the time the clock struck midnight, Daniel Whitmore was no longer a groom on honeymoon. He was a man consumed by rage. Hotel staff later testified that guests in neighboring villas had called reception, complaining about loud arguments and shouting from the suite. Some said they heard a man's deep voice, harsh and furious. Others recalled a woman's cries, muffled but desperate. Inside, Daniel confronted Alisha once more. He demanded answers, pushing her to confess every detail of her past. Each word she gave him only stoked his fury. She begged him to stop, telling him that none of it mattered, that she loved him, that the past was dead. But for Daniel, it wasn't love he heard in her words. It was betrayal. The argument turned physical. Investigators pieced together what happened through the evidence left behind. Broken glass scattered across the floor, a shattered lamp near the bed, blood on the edge of the dresser. Forensic analysis later confirmed signs of a violent struggle, finger-shaped bruises on Alisha's arms, defensive wounds on her hands. Witnesses recalled hearing a chilling scream, cut short. In a fit of rage, Daniel struck her, first with his fists, then, according to prosecutors, by slamming her against the hard surface of the dresser. Alisha collapsed, dazed but still conscious, trying to crawl away. Daniel followed. What happened next was quick, brutal, and irreversible. Medical reports would later confirm the cause of death: blunt force trauma to the head and strangulation. In his frenzy, Daniel had not only beaten her but pressed his hands around her neck until her body went limp. When it was over, silence filled the villa. Daniel stood over his wife's lifeless body, his hands trembling, his chest heaving. The reality of what he had done began to sink in. His perfect marriage, his perfect image, his carefully constructed world, it was gone in an instant. For several minutes, Daniel did nothing. He poured himself another drink, sat at the edge of the bed, and stared at the body. He later claimed he blacked out, that he couldn't remember the final moments. But the crime scene told a different story, one of rage, control, and deliberate violence. At 2:17 a.m., Daniel finally called hotel reception. His voice was calm, almost detached. "Something has happened to my wife," he said. When staff arrived, they found Alisha lying motionless on the floor. Daniel was pacing the room, his shirt stained with blood, his knuckles bruised. He offered no explanation, only repeating that it was an accident, that she had fallen, that he had tried to help. But the evidence spoke louder than his words. Police were summoned immediately. Daniel was taken into custody that night, his passport confiscated. Alisha's body was transferred to the nearest medical facility, where the autopsy would confirm what investigators already suspected: this was no accident. The honeymoon was over. The Paradise Island had become a crime scene. And Daniel Whitmore, once a celebrated groom, was now a murderer awaiting trial. When the call came into Malay police headquarters just after 2 in the morning, officers at first thought it was another tourist emergency. An accident, a medical crisis, perhaps a drunken fall. But when investigators arrived at the luxury resort and stepped inside Villa 12, they immediately knew this was no accident. The crime scene was chaotic. Furniture overturned, glass shattered across the marble floor, blood spattered against the dresser. In the center of it all lay the body of 26-year-old Alisha Whitmore, her neck marked with deep bruises, her face swollen from blunt force trauma. Standing nearby was her husband, Daniel Whitmore. His white shirt was stained with blood, his knuckles raw and split. He reeked of alcohol, his eyes bloodshot but sharp with defiance. To the officers, he offered the same story again and again. "It was an accident. She fell. I tried to help." But the forensic evidence told a different story. The autopsy revealed that Alisha had not simply fallen. She had suffered repeated blows to the head and body. Her injuries were consistent with strangulation, and the pattern of bruises on her arms and hands indicated defensive wounds. She had fought back. Investigators began piecing together the hours before her death. Resort staff came forward with reports of shouting and screams from the villa. One guest even claimed he heard Alisha cry out, "Please stop," before the noise abruptly ended. Police confiscated Daniel's phone, along with Alisha's. What they uncovered was the missing link in the chain of events. On Alisha's phone were messages from an unknown sender, warning her that her past could not stay hidden. On Daniel's phone, calls to a close associate and to his lawyer back in Toronto, calls made within hours of the murder, laced with anger and desperation. It became clear to investigators the motive was betrayal. But the investigation didn't stop with the crime itself. As international media descended on the Maldives, questions swirled about who Daniel and Alisha really were. Reporters dug into their backgrounds, painting a picture of wealth colliding with ambition, pride colliding with secrets. Daniel, once respected in Canadian business circles, was now portrayed as a man with a temper, someone obsessed with control and reputation. Former acquaintances recalled arguments in public, flashes of anger when things didn't go his way. Some described him as generous, others as dangerous. Alisha's story was even more complicated. Investigators confirmed that she had been in a relationship before meeting Daniel, possibly even a secret marriage. Immigration records suggested inconsistencies in her visa applications, raising speculation that she may have been involved in a sham arrangement at some point. Friends insisted she had simply made mistakes in her pursuit of a better life. But to Daniel, those mistakes had felt like unforgivable deceit. The case soon captured headlines across the globe. "Canadian millionaire arrested for wife's murder on honeymoon." Images of Daniel being escorted by police, once a groom in a tailored suit, now a prisoner in handcuffs, spread like wildfire. For Maldivian authorities, the pressure was immense. They were determined to show the world that justice would be served, no matter the wealth or nationality of the accused. As the evidence mounted, Daniel's version of events crumbled. His claims of an accident could not explain the multiple injuries. His story of trying to save her could not explain the marks around her neck. And his insistence that he loved his wife could not erase the fact that, in a moment of rage, he had killed her. By the end of the investigation, prosecutors were ready. They had the crime scene, the witness accounts, the forensic reports, and the motive. What remained was the trial, where Daniel would face not only the Maldivian justice system, but also the full weight of his shattered reputation. The Honeymoon murder had become an international scandal, and for Daniel Whitmore, the fight of his life was only beginning. The trial of Daniel Whitmore began 6 months after Alisha's death, inside the High Court of Malay. The courtroom was small, modest compared to the grand halls Daniel was used to in Toronto, but it was packed to capacity. Journalists from Canada, India, the UK, and beyond filled the benches. Outside, cameras flashed as protesters held signs demanding justice for Alisha. The prosecution opened with a simple but devastating claim. This was not an accident. This was murder born out of rage, control, and betrayal. They laid out the case in chilling detail. The crime scene photos, overturned furniture, blood stains, Alisha's lifeless body, were projected onto a screen. Forensic experts testified that her injuries were not consistent with a fall, but with repeated blows and strangulation. The bruises on her arms were described as classic signs of defensive resistance. Witnesses from the resort were called. One honeymooning couple recalled hearing screaming like someone begging for help. A staff member testified that when he entered the villa, Daniel was pacing the room, his voice flat, saying only, "She fell, she fell." The prosecution painted Daniel as a man obsessed with image, unable to tolerate humiliation. When he learned of Alisha's past, her former relationship, the hints of deceit, his pride collapsed into rage, and in that rage he ended her life. But the defense fought back aggressively. Daniel's lawyer, a high-profile Canadian attorney flown in for the trial, argued that the case was based on circumstantial evidence and media hysteria. He insisted that Daniel had loved Alisha deeply, and that her death was the tragic result of an accident compounded by alcohol and stress. "He is not a monster," the lawyer told the court. "He is a grieving husband, vilified by the press, judged before he even had a chance to speak." The defense introduced its own narrative, that Alisha may have fallen during the struggle, striking her head fatally, while Daniel, panicked and intoxicated, failed to respond appropriately. They attacked the credibility of the witnesses, claiming their recollections were distorted by distance, darkness, and the power of suggestion. But the prosecution's strongest weapon was Daniel himself. When he took the stand, dressed in a plain white shirt and looking thinner than before, he tried to present himself as broken, remorseful. He spoke of Alisha as the love of my life, his voice cracking at moments. Yet under cross-examination, cracks in his story emerged. "Why did you call your lawyer before calling the police?" the prosecutor asked sharply. Daniel hesitated, fumbling. "I was confused. I didn't know what to do." "Why were there defensive wounds on your wife's hands?" She must have flailed when she fell." "And finally, why were your hands around her neck?" Daniel's silence filled the room. By the end of the trial, the weight of evidence was overwhelming. The jury deliberated for only 3 hours before returning with their verdict: guilty of murder. The judge delivered a scathing rebuke. "You chose violence over reason. You chose pride over love, and you took a life in the most brutal way." Daniel Whitmore was sentenced to life imprisonment under Maldivian law. Outside the courthouse, the verdict was met with cheers from Alisha's supporters and somber silence from Daniel's family. For the international press, it was the climax of a scandal that had transfixed millions, the tale of a fairy tale wedding that ended in bloodshed. But for those closest to Alisha, it was no victory, only a reminder that justice, though delivered, could never bring her back. When the courtroom doors closed on Daniel Whitmore's sentencing, the world moved on to the next headline. But for the families left behind, the aftermath of the Honeymoon murder was just beginning. In Toronto, the Whitmore family, once respected in business and social circles, faced public shame. Daniel's father, a wealthy developer, retreated from public life, his reputation in ruins. Friends who once attended glittering charity galas with the family now distanced themselves. For them, Daniel was no longer a golden boy but a convicted killer. Alisha's family, scattered between India and Canada, carried a different burden. They mourned a daughter who had sought love and a better life, only to meet her death at the hands of the man she trusted most. Her mother, interviewed by Indian media, wept as she held her daughter's photo. She wanted happiness. She wanted to build a family. Instead, she found death. In the Maldives, the case left scars of its own. The luxury resort where the murder took place quietly remodeled Villa 12, erasing the physical reminders of the crime. But among staff, whispers lingered about the night paradise turned into a crime scene. For Maldivian authorities, the successful conviction was proof that justice could be applied fairly, even against powerful foreigners. Meanwhile, international media turned the story into a spectacle. Headlines screamed about betrayal, rage, and deadly secrets. Tabloids portrayed Daniel as a cold-blooded millionaire groom and Alisha as the bride with a hidden past. Documentaries and podcasts dissected every detail, from Alisha's text messages to Daniel's final breakdown on the witness stand. Yet beneath the sensationalism, deeper conversations emerged. Domestic violence advocates pointed out that Daniel's actions were not an isolated outburst, but part of a larger pattern of control and rage. What happened in that villa is the extreme end of a cycle of abuse, one Canadian advocate explained. It shows how quickly love can become dangerous when pride, secrecy, and violence collide. For Alisha's friends, her death became a cautionary tale. Some remembered her as ambitious and hopeful, determined to rewrite her life story in a new country. Others admitted they had worried about Daniel's temper, his need to dominate conversations, his subtle dismissals of her independence. Daniel, serving his life sentence in a Maldivian prison, faded from the spotlight. He filed appeals, all of which were denied. Occasionally, his name resurfaced in the press, but the world largely forgot him, except for those who remembered the story as a symbol of paradise turned into hell. The legacy of the case was more than a headline. It was a grim reminder of the fragile line between love and violence, trust and betrayal. What began as a wedding meant to unite two lives had ended in the destruction of both. For true crime audiences, the story fit the pattern they couldn't turn away from: wealth, romance, scandal, and bloodshed. For those who knew Alisha personally, it was a tragedy that would never leave them. Years later, one of her closest friends summed it up in an interview. She believed in second chances, in new beginnings, but she chose the wrong man to build that life with, and he couldn't forgive her for being human. In the end, the Honeymoon murder wasn't just about a man and woman. It was about the cost of secrets, the dangers of pride, and the brutal truth that sometimes the greatest threats come from the ones we trust most.